Anytime there's an expression of sadness or anger, there's a humanity there. I have to see, I have to listen to, I have to anchor in that type of humanity. We all will grow old, get sick, and die. We all love and are loved. We all have had our hearts broken. We've all experienced profound joy and emotion and sorrow and happiness. And for me, that is helpful.
Hey friends, welcome to the Changing Work Podcast. We are so glad you're here.
My name is Nick.
And I'm Scott.
And this is the podcast where we talk about changing work from the inside out.
So if you're into making the workplace and the world a better experience via conscious business practices, stick around. This is for you. Good morning, David. How are you?
Scott, good morning. It's really good to see you. And whenever I see that guitar in the background, somehow it just makes the day perfect.
Well, I appreciate that. No plans to play it today, but hey, you know, my arm has been twisted before, but I'm gonna read a little bit about your background, and then we'll get started. Does that sound good? So, David Simas is the managing director of research and impact at Emerson Collective, where he works to develop in-depth research projects and distributes findings and analysis in service of Emerson's priorities, including democracy, immigration, education, and climate. And David had the, I think, amazing experience to work with President Obama in the Obama administration starting in 2009 through 2016 in a variety of roles, from deputy assistant to director of opinion research. And then after the time in office, he was invited to be the CEO of the Obama Foundation and served in that capacity for some time. Thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate you.
Scott, it's a real pleasure. I've been looking forward to this.
So before we get started in all of the, let's say, more mental things, I'm curious, what makes your heart light up?
Oh my! Every time, especially in the morning when I see my wife and daughters for the first time, it's something that I remember from especially my mom, who had this habit, although she would express it differently, around just the magic of a new day. And they'll all laugh at me, where literally, Scott, every morning I will say something like, "We get to do this again." And it's both a way of connecting, but also in a subtle and nuanced way, a good reminder of, you know, how precious, not to be overly precious about it, but how amazing this is. And so that always just sparks me immediately, and I'm so lucky to have that.
That is a fantastic piece of advice. Imagine if we all approached the day like that. It's like, oh, we get to do this again.
Right. Right, because you see so often people who either physically or mentally or spiritually, in one way or another, don't. And right, Scott, not every day is pleasant. But that just reminder, at least for me, provides that spark and joy. So
I love it. Well, our topic today is the power of mentoring. And it occurs to me that you had perhaps one of the most famous and maybe best mentors that I can think of in President Obama. Could you share a little bit about what that experience was like?
it was surreal, just about every day. And while the settings were different, and Scott, getting called into the Oval Office, whenever it occurred, there was always this moment before you walk into the room where all of a sudden the images and the memories of previous encounters, but also the perception of what had happened in that room And just the way he occupied it with the different images and the way he carried himself was surreal. But the thing that strikes me even now in retrospect was just the consistency of behavior, informed by a core set of values. That was just essentially the essence of the relationship in model. So, for example, the world could be on a given day just in turmoil, as it often was. And ultimately, he was faced with, and any president is faced with, making a certain series of choices, none of which are going to be perfect. And you understand that and you wrestle with it. But in that moment of high stress and high tension, where there are very few people on the planet who are feeling it the way he is, all of us around him saw that consistency of behavior that sometimes we would describe as never too high, never too low, taking a step back, analyzing as much information as you possibly can, discerning and thinking about different options and perspectives, but then trying to root them in core fundamental values and principles so that you are anchored and tethered. And it was never explicit, like this is the way you do leadership or decision making. But for all of us around him, when we were feeling stress, and I found this myself to say, well, look, if he's not necessarily serene, but if he is approaching it in this way, certainly I can do the same, because I can't imagine 1% of what he is feeling at this given moment. And so it was the behavior in that type of interaction that for me was, in some ways, the strongest type of mentorship that I've been exposed to with him.
That's a really interesting point. I've been around leaders who were fantastic coaches, one-on-one, behind closed doors. They were fantastic coaches. They were all about the questioning. I've been around other leaders who it was all by example, and they were extraordinary on stage. They were extraordinary in a meeting, but as a one-on-one coach, I didn't quite get what I wanted from them. And I had to know their strengths. And so I'm curious, you mentioned that President Obama sounded like led by example. Was he also a coach, or that just wasn't part of his repertoire?
No, I think it is, but the limitations, especially in that office, are the limitations on time, where literally every 15 minutes is scheduled and accounted for, and so the interactions for that type of engagement are in the moments in between the schedule. But even there, when I had the luxury of having those, and my colleagues also, the giving of feedback was always done in a way where it wasn't about telling you what to do or what not to do. It took the style and form of, walk me through how you thought about X. How did you think about Y? What did you do, right? It was this very kind of Socratic approach that wasn't prescriptive. It wasn't, this is wrong and this is right. Because especially there in that building, when you move beyond the core values and principles, the conditions and situations change so dramatically. And the information that you are receiving is so fleeting and multivaried that the discernment or the determination of this is right and this is wrong is rare. He would describe it as usually most decisions, by the time it gets to that desk, are 51-49 decisions. They're 52-48 decisions. Because if they were easier, they would have been decided by someone else before it got there. And so that was the one-on-one type of approach that was episodic, but that's the form that it took, that I think is very consistent with what I just observed in terms of his interpersonal style and his leadership style, and also rooted in a deep sense of both empathy and compassion. The ability and the intention, even when you're reading a briefing about a meeting with whether it's a foreign leader or a member of Congress or someone else, the deliberate action of putting yourself in their shoes so that you understand their incentives, their perspective, and the dynamics and conditions and situations that they are reacting to or directing. So it was all part of this wonderful mix. So it was a joy, Scott.
It sounds pretty amazing. As you talk about it, the decisions being 50-50, 49-51, it occurs to me that the country, in our case, the US, is kind of like that as well. 50-50, 45-55. And so by the time it gets there, he not only has to represent Democrats, but represent all citizens. And I gather he took that role very seriously. And so what I hear you talking about is curiosity. Curiosity for every side, curiosity for the process of how do we even make this decision, curiosity for what is right. And so I'm wondering if you could speak more about curiosity from that position and curiosity, the qualities of curiosity needed by every leader.
So there is, it is a curiosity that is tempered by and informed by a sense of humility, especially what you said about having to represent all citizens. That requires you to have your beliefs and your perspectives around this specific issue, the outcome that I would like for these following reasons. But between my intentions and the outcomes, the path that you take has to be super, super flexible because of the multiplicity of forces and influences who will have a say, not just yours, even in that position. So there's a humility there just from a power perspective. The other sense of humility that I think is important to make that curiosity, to unleash that curiosity, is to not be too tied to either your preferred approach, your specific ideology, or to be blinded by the idea that just because someone else is of a different party or a different nation, has different incentives, different worldviews, that they are either wrong from the beginning, venal, or have impure motives. Now, some of that may be true, but if that's the way you approach the conversations, you are literally blinding yourself to the possibility of learning something and appreciating something that is of essence in that given moment. And so that curiosity needs to be the default mode, but it needs to be then tempered with, hold your beliefs, but hold them lightly. Which is something that I just saw consistently. This I believe, this I would like to see, which is the job of the leader, is to point, we're going here, but then maintain maximum flexibility around notions of consensus in broad understandings of democracy, especially in the, forgive me for getting all nerdy on this, but the beauty and the essence of the American Republic, our democracy, and the experiment that it is the crazy idea that the people are sovereign. And if you begin with the idea that the people are sovereign, not the members of Congress or the President of the United States, but Scott, you and me and everyone watching, that means you need to treat them with the respect and the dignity, even when you disagree with them tremendously, that they are equals in that regard. That's a mindset that I think is important and that I saw Not always. We are super imperfect and flawed, but more often than not.
That's beautiful. Let me circle back to mentoring for a bit. It sounds like, well, actually, let me ask you, with all of that, and in this very unique expression of experience that you got to have, what did that teach you about being a good mentor that you're able to carry on to your daughters or to the people around you?
Yeah. There are a couple of pieces that, for me, at least, when I talk to my daughters, one is 25 and one is 18, and the first is to find people who, in whatever work that they are doing, that they are interested in, who are exceptional, not just in the work that they do, but in how they do it, especially the how piece. Because the disciplines, the day-to-day, some component parts of what constitutes someone's character on a personal level, on a professional level, is actually where the education for me in my life has come from. And so I urge that. The second thing is, and this goes back to what I was saying about time, to be very respectful of time. And to enter into or seek those relationships in a way where you are cognizant of the limitations of time in the preparation that you should bring to those encounters, and be mindful and respectful of them, and based upon the interaction with the person, be explicit or not about, look, I want to pursue this today. And then the third piece is, I think, which is the flip side of that, is to understand that for good mentors, they're also in a feedback mode. They will learn something from you, even if it's just a wildly different perspective that's informed by your experience. And so rather than simply being a receptacle on the receiving end, be aware of and open to entering into the conversations where you can say, oh, that's interesting. My perspective on this is X based upon these factors. What do you think about that? So rather than just treating the mentor like ChatGPT or Google or some version of that, right? It's like there's an opportunity for a conversation, because then you begin to see even the way people think and they process and they engage. And in any organization or in any type of environment, that two-way street is essential. And so build that in from the beginning.
Beautiful. I know at the Obama Foundation, mentoring at scale was very important in helping young people thrive. Could you talk more about that? And then perhaps if there are lessons that any organization can learn from that about how to build their own mentoring programs.
Yeah. First, we were intentional about the idea of building a culture of mentorship. And that meant consistently, in terms of communications, highlighting examples of generous and effective mentors. So again, establishing that North Star. This is what it looks like. Once you've done that and you have this notion of a culture, then it's about the training of and beginning to set up processes of, so that, if you're lucky, it just happens. But there are ways to establish processes and trainings that make it more likely that you then meet the exemplar, the culture that you're trying to establish. Underneath that, flowing then from the training, essentially, is creating the conditions at all levels of the organization, even to the most junior level, where there are these built-in opportunities for engagement and mentorship, whether it's certain periods of time, certain modes of communication, certain expectations about what you do. And then, finally is a version of providing tools or different types of platforms to remove as much of the friction that is attendant to that. And so, like everything else, as an organization, the Obama Foundation, that was rooted in community organizing. Community organizing has very basic principles that are grounded in one-on-one interactions, but then can multiply to broader groups of individuals. And so, culture, training, systems and platforms repeat.
Mm-hmm.
And then on a periodic basis, against the cultural exemplars, make sure, whether it's monthly or quarterly or whenever, you are lifting up these real life examples of people within the organization who now are modeling that.
Mm-hmm.
And because people will respond to that. I want to be like that. Oh, I didn't know that this could be this way. And so, Scott, in my opinion, these things just don't happen. And if they do, it's serendipity on a one-on-one basis or even a little bit more than that.
Mm-hmm.
But any good organization follows, I think, these types of processes and builds these types of systems.
Love it. So it sounds like, if I play it back, we set the expectation that this is going to happen. We create the environment, we create the tools, and then we tell the stories to reinforce that this is the behavior we're looking for. Yeah. It occurs to me that is not just a recipe for mentoring, it's a recipe for almost every good cultural tenet that you want to employ. Yeah.
100%.
One of the things that occurs to me is that you are a professional listener. And I don't know if you would describe yourself that way, but some of the roles you've had, from political researcher, essentially, in my limited view, learning what people think so that we can make decisions from them. What actually, first of all, is that true? Do you think of yourself in that way? And then what have you learned from all of this listening?
I think that's an important part of my professional journey. It's really been grounded in listening as the most important part of the feedback loop that you create. And it took a variety of different forms, but the thing that comes closest to it is, imagine when I was especially in the White House, on a Tuesday morning, you fly to someplace in Iowa. On Tuesday afternoon, no one knows who you are, but I'm sitting, at a diner or in a restaurant, and I'm striking up conversations, but they're not directed. You're just processing and listening. And then I'm behind a two-way mirror, hearing as people wrestle with things that are important to them in their community. And the most important piece for me, which has been part of my contemplative practice, is the ability to hear and to see is limited and encumbered by my thoughts and my perceptions of what I want it to be or what I don't want it to be, which is normal. We have our priors informed by our experience and who we are. But at that moment, you have to not just hear, but you also at the same time have to say, look, I need to, whatever anger or revulsion or joy or connection I'm making has to be put aside. Because only there can you try to get at emotion, incentives, motives, and the fact that the overwhelming majority of people that I have heard, met, and listened to in my life are more than one thing. They are more than this opinion on this. They are conflicted. They are always seeking some type of balance. They are informed by the people around them, by the group culture that they are a part of, by whatever the inputs that have arisen at that moment that increase the level of salience of a specific thing. All of these different factors lead to what my greatest finding has been, or my greatest learning in the way I approach it, is I have to be curious about what I am hearing my fellow sovereign say.
Mm.
And if it's something I don't agree with, there is an essence to what I can't just immediately write it off. At the end of the day, it may be something that I just fundamentally disagree with or even oppose. But that person isn't alone. In a republic like ours, in the American democracy, where essentially the entire process is about mediating a multiplicity of different opinions and views and perspectives among a group of people who are all sovereign. It's essential that we enter into these conversations with not this overly sentimental view of consensus and compromise, but around this constant, almost like a constant searching for equilibrium. Because in that equilibrium, essentially, that's the way we flourish. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. This happens, there are these reactions. This condition occurs, this condition follows it. And it's a constant changing. And the listening, at least for me, gives me an insight into as many of those different factors as possible that then allows me to, either on my own or in service of folks who are making decision, to say, all right, consider this or consider that, informed not by my views. Well, my views will always be there, but they have to be tempered, but informed by as many different opinions in a diversity of thought, in a diversity of experience, in a diversity of perspective that just enriches and is the lifeblood of our republic, our democracy. And so that's, and as hopefully you can see, Scott, and have seen, it's a joy, even when it's hard.
That's beautiful. All right, I want to make this real for everyone who's listening, right? Because I think this is black belt level listening skills, or 9th degree black belt listening skills. When you're sat in front of someone who maybe you don't agree with, maybe you vehemently disagree with, I'm curious, what's the story you tell yourself, or what's the hack you use to remain centered, to remain curious, to not let your own thoughts and beliefs and opinions and noise get in the way?
Yeah, it's different almost every time, and it depends upon the type of session. But usually it comes down to, Scott, to, I'm imagining one specific person now in Las Vegas who was, saying stuff that was pretty raw. But he also 5 minutes before had talked about his daughter. Right? Anytime there's an expression of sadness or anger, there's a humanity there. I have to see, I have to listen to, I have to anchor in that type of humanity. I'm a dad too. He's a dad. Right? We all, we all will grow old, get sick, and die. We all love and are loved. We all have had our hearts broken. We've all experienced profound joy and emotion and sorrow and happiness. That guy too. And for me, that is helpful in just kind of regulating what will pop into my mind. In the preconceived notion about that person is a hater, that person is this, that person is that. It's there, right, Scott? That'll never go away. But when it gets there, then to try to get back to, okay, there's something else here that I am missing. And to do that in a way that isn't paternalistic or elite. That conveys some kind of, I am virtuous because I am overcoming, right? It's like, it's the type of paternalistic empathy. Oh, I'm going to make myself, I'm trying to understand you. Even in that listening, there are flavors of that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And as we enter, or we have entered, this next round of election cycle, which fans the flames of partisanship, it fans the flames of division, what you're saying feels like the root of what could keep us together. This curiosity, this seeing the other person as like me, feels like the kernel of where we start to say, actually, we're not all that different.
Yeah, that's and Scott, I hear it every week when I'm listening to voters, whether they are supporting former President Trump or President Biden or any one of the other Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Cornel West, Jill Stein. There is a hunger among almost all of these people to get past the interpersonal recrimination, right? It's almost as if they can separate, okay, I will have these strong, oftentimes negative feelings about the candidates. But that need not mean that I am going to have this about especially family who disagree with me or friends who disagree with me. Because at the end of the day, those relationships, those connections should transcend because we are more than the party or the candidate. And sometimes it makes it easier to say, well, if they support X, it means that person is Y in their totality and their whole. I have yet to meet someone who is that binary and simplistic.
Sure.
So
beautiful. All right. Well, we are nearly at time, and knowing what you know, listening the way you listen, seeing what's going on at the core of America and the world, what gives you hope?
Yeah, it's that there is an whether it's resilience or the human capacity to adapt, the human desire to be not in conflict but in common. People have that, and so it's rare that there's a person who wants to be in conflict. And I've seen that. And so with all of the swirl that creates different conditions, that's the thing that for me is the most hopeful, is that given a choice, people will go to what I have in common with you, even if it's hard to find, versus conflict, because the conflict is painful for folks. They don't like it. No, I've yet to meet someone who in their core prefers to be in this I'm in conflict dynamic. That for me is, with all the technological changes and all of the things that occur, that basic element that in some ways is core to humans around being in society and being in a group together, that gives me hope.
Beautiful. David Simas, thank you for the work you do in the world. Thank you for being an amazing human. And thank you for your time here today.
Scott, thank you for what you do. I'm really grateful. And I hope you have a good rest of the day. And I hope you bust out the guitar later on.
All right. Thanks, David.